This is a creepy panda production. Bigfoot's Bewitchment. Walking through the towering redwoods of Northern California always gave me a sense of tranquility. However, this time, the usually peaceful forest felt eerie, filling me with an inexplicable dread. My camping trip in the Six Rivers National Forest was intended to be a solo adventure, a chance to get away from the city noise and reconnect with nature. Little did I know, I would encounter something far beyond my understanding. The first night passed without incident, save for the distant howls that seemed too guttural for any wolf. By the second day, the sense of being watched became overwhelming. I pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to the isolation and perhaps a bear nearby. As I hiked back to camp after a day of fishing by the Trinity River, I noticed my supplies were scattered about. My initial thought was a bear, so I set up a makeshift alarm system using fishing lines and cans. That night, the forest was silent, too silent. As I lay in my tent, a sudden clang sent me bolting upright. Clammy palms and a racing heart accompanied me as I cautiously unzipped the tent and peered out. What I saw wasn't a bear. Standing on two legs, with matted fur and piercing eyes, was a creature of legend, Bigfoot. In that moment, my skepticism about cryptids vanished. Before I could even process my next action, the silhouette turned and disappeared into the trees. The following morning was a blur of panic and haste as I packed up my gear. My logical mind grappled with whether the event had been a dream or reality. Going to the local authorities in Crescent City with such a tale was a laughable option. Instead, I sought out the only person who might have answers, a rumored expert on the local folklore who ran a small museum dedicated to Bigfoot evidence right there in Willow Creek. When I arrived, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon. The curator, a bearded man named Martin, listened intently to my story, nodding as if my encounter wasn't the first he'd heard. After a deep sigh, he decided to confide in me. "They're protectors of the forest," Martin said, "but something's been stirring them up, making them more intense. There are old tales of a bewitchment placed long ago on these woods, attracting and trapping spirits here." My skepticism began to resurface until he showed me a map of recent sightings, all clustered around one specific area of the forest, where I camped. He cautioned me to stay away, but my curiosity was stronger. "I have to know more," I declared. Martin hesitated before agreeing to guide me back into the woods the next day, as long as I adhered to his strict set of rules, which included a bizarre variety of talismans and rituals that he claimed would protect us. Dawn broke with a mist clinging to the forest floor. We hiked into the heart of the redwoods, the previous night's creature never far from my mind. Martin carried a satchel filled with herbs and small engraved stones, muttering occasionally in a language I couldn't recognize. As we neared the site of my encounter, the air grew thick, and an unnatural chill seeped through my clothes. "Here," Martin said, stopping in a small clearing. "This is where the veil between worlds is thin." He began arranging stones in a peculiar pattern, and I handed him the items he requested. With each object placed, the silence of the forest seemed more profound, as though nature itself was holding its breath. As Martin completed the arrangement, there was a shift in the atmosphere. The ground beneath us vibrated with a low frequency, and the temperature dropped further. Suddenly, the stillness was shattered by a cacophonous wail that resonated through the trees. Emerging from the twilight, multiple figures appeared, their eyes reflecting the dwindling light. My body froze, but Martin stepped forward, holding out an amulet. The creatures stopped, their growls quieting to curious hums. It was clear these were no ordinary animals. Their demeanor held an intelligence and complexity that defied natural order. The creatures encircled us, and in that center of supernatural beings, I felt an odd peace. Martin began to speak in their guttural language, making gestures of peace. To my astonishment, one creature stepped forward, its gaze locked with mine. There was a connection, a sharing of unspoken understanding, and in that moment, I knew we were not enemies. With Martin's guidance, we spent the fleeting daylight hours in a surreal communion with the beings. They were guardians, he explained, disturbed by an intrusion on their sacred land by someone seeking to exploit the forest for its resources. The bewitchment Martin spoke of wasn't placed by ancient peoples. but a recent curse from a malignant force that sought to dominate the land. As the sun slipped behind the horizon and the forest darkened, the creatures retreated into the shadows. Martin and I packed our belongings, our mission clear. We were to become stewards to safeguard these mystical guardians and their domain. The walk back was silent, introspective. Arriving at the edge of the forest, I turned for one last look at the towering sentinels that hid wonders and horrors beyond human comprehension. My life was forever altered. As I drove back to civilization, the radio spouted the latest news, but my thoughts lingered on the profound secrets held within the Bigfoot's bewitchment, protecting their ancient home against the encroachments of modernity. The story I would tell would be one of respect, wonder, and a plea to preserve the enigma and the wilderness that birthed it. Chupacabra Unleashed. Darkness had already embraced the little town of Seguin, Texas, as we gathered around the campfire, the mesquite wood crackling, projecting ghostly shadows on our faces. A buddy of mine, Ricky, with a penchant for tall tales, was going on about the creature sightings around nearby ranches. "They call it the Chupacabra," he said, his eyes reflecting the fire's fierce dance. My skepticism had always been a point of amusement among my friends. "Come on, it's probably just a coyote with mange," I scoffed, munching on a burnt marshmallow. We all settled in our tents later that night, the fire reduced to a comforting glow. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, an eerie sound cut through the silence, the screech of an animal, unlike anything I'd heard before. The next morning, we discovered our cooler had been ripped open, contents strewn all about. Ricky threw me a knowing look. "Still think it's just a coyote?" I had to admit the damage seemed too severe for a common predator. A local old Mr. Hernandez saw us examining the chaos. He approached, leaning heavily on his cane. "Best be careful. La Chupacabra is no myth. It's been seen near the Pecan Creek Trail." His warning sent a chill through me, but curiosity outweighed fear. "We should check it out," Ricky ventured with a mix of excitement and dread in his voice. And so we set out for the trail, cameras in hand, half joking about finding the beast. As we trekked along Pecan Creek Trail, the quiet of the woods was unsettling. Every snap of a twig underfoot seemed amplified. We found more signs of disturbance: an overturned trash bin, a chicken coop torn open, feathers everywhere but no chickens to be found. We reached a clearing as the sun dipped low in the sky. There, in the fading light, something moved at the edge of the trees. It was a creature, not large, but with a strange gait and sharp, pointed ears. It appeared and vanished quickly, leaving us to question if it had been there at all. "That was it!" Ricky exclaimed. "The Chupacabra!" I wasn't convinced until we heard it. The same blood-curdling scream from the night before, only this time it was close, too close. Panic coursed through us. We fumbled with our cameras, but the settings were all wrong in our haste. The creature's screams grew closer, circling us, hunting. Then from the darkness, two glowing eyes fixed on us. We were being watched, stalked. We chose flight over fight, running back along the trail, the eyes and shrill screams pursuing us. I risked a backward glance and saw it, a silhouette that matched no known animal. We barreled out of the woods onto the road, the creature's cries finally trailing away. Gasping for breath, we didn't stop running until we reached our campsite. We spent a restless night, with every sound outside the tents setting off alarms in our heads. Come dawn, we found large, three-toed prints around our campsite. They were unrecognizable, not matching any predator native to Texas. We couldn't deny it anymore. Something unnatural was lurking in the woods of Seguin. The Chupacabra, a legend I'd dismissed as fiction, had made its presence terrifyingly clear. We packed up and drove back to civilization in silence. And though we spoke little of it afterwards, the fear of what we encountered in the woods of Texas stayed with each of us, a haunting memory of the night the Chupacabra was unleashed. Mothman's return. My grandma always told me tales about the strange happenings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. They were always quaint little ghost stories, the kind meant to spook kids during a sleepover. That was until she brought up the Mothman. The insistence in her voice and the solemn dread on her face weren't the usual overtones of a story meant for fun. The legend was a part of town, but for her it was more, a memory soaked in fear. Fast forward to my adult years. and I found myself inheriting her old property in that very town. I'd forgotten those eerie tales, writing them off as fables. But, arriving at the house, a shiver of something more than cold passed through me. It's crazy how the mind retrieves such feelings from the depths of dismissed memories. The locals still whispered about the Mothman every now and again, but it was no more real to me than Bigfoot or the Loch Ness monster. On a particularly bleak night, a storm was brewing. I lounged on the old rocking chair that belonged to my grandma, a book in hand, trying to relax. Lights flickered, thunder boomed, and I found myself alone with the sound of rain pelting the windows. Then the power went out altogether. Just great, I thought, reaching for a flashlight. As the moon escaped the grasp of storm clouds, it cast an eerie silver light through the house. I froze when I saw it, or thought I did. A sharp tap against the window pane. It couldn't be. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I moved toward the window, the beam of the flashlight bobbing with every shaky step I took. I pulled back the curtain slightly, peering into the darkness, expecting to find nothing but the storm. Instead, I saw two intense red eyes staring right back at me. A gasp escaped my lips, and I stumbled backward. Those couldn't be eyes. This must be a trick of the light, I rationalized, or one of those reflective objects meant to scare off wildlife. But as the figure moved, I realized with horror that those eyes were attached to something large and humanoid. With each flash of lightning, its form became clearer. Giant wings, a head that seemed part of its shoulder, no neck, and those red eyes that never blinked. It soared upward and out of view. My logical mind fought the terror, urging me to check outside. There had to be a logical explanation. Bears or large birds, perhaps? My childhood fears seemed to be manifesting in the worst possible way. Adrenaline fueled my courage, so I opened the door. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the storm was moving on. I stepped out onto the porch, my flashlight's beam darting around the front yard. Nothing. Trees swayed gently in the post-storm breeze, and I started to feel foolish until I heard a rustling in the woods beyond the property. What emerged wasn't a creature known to any wildlife guide. It was tall, must have been over 7 feet, with large wings folded behind it. And the eyes, they were unmistakable, even without a flashlight to reflect them. They were like red embers in the dark. Every rational thought told me to run back into the house, lock the door, and call for help. But my feet felt rooted to the wood beneath me. It stared at me, silent, and I got the uncanny sense it was curious or studying me. I couldn't move or look away, transfixed by the impossibility before me. Then it tilted its head, this giant menacing silhouette, as a flash of lightning gave it stark, terrifying detail once more. The Mothman, the creature of all those forgotten childhood fears. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it turned, and with a few powerful beats of its massive wings, the Mothman was gone, retreating back into the shadows from which it had emerged. After a moment, I regained control of my limbs, scrambling back into the house, locking everything behind me, the only sound my own jagged breaths. The next day I talked to some people around town, only to find rumors swirling. Some claimed they too had seen a massive shadow flying past during the storm. Everyone was on edge, whispering about the same thing. The Mothman had returned. They spoke of old prophecies, of disaster following in the creature's wake. I tried to shrug it off, to bury it deep down with the other childhood fictions, but this was different. There was no denying what my eyes had witnessed. What frightened me more was the heavy sense that this return meant something, an omen of something yet to come. My days became a blur of anxieties, always keeping an eye on the skies. Every shadow at night brought back the stark fear of those red eyes, the overpowering presence of the Mothman watching, waiting for something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. Weeks passed. An uneasy quiet settled over Point Pleasant, and with each passing day, I hoped it was all over. But the town was hit by a sequence of bizarre incidents. Pets went missing, odd electrical malfunctions, and finally, an accident on the Silver Bridge that connected our town to Ohio. No one was seriously hurt, but the whispers grew louder. I decided to scour my grandma's old books and local records, desperate for answers. Scrapbooks, old newspapers, anything I could find that mentioned the Mothman. It was clear from the accounts that the creature's appearance always preceded misfortune. But was it cause or warning? the stories never made that link clear. It was then that I found an entry in my grandmother's handwriting. The Mothman comes not with malice, but with warning. A guardian frightful in form, but benevolent in intent. Heed its appearance, prepare for the strains, for it only reveals itself when the balance is threatened. I realized that my fear had blinded me to what may be the truth of the Mothman's existence. If Grandma was right, it didn't come to bring disaster, but to signal it, a supernatural litmus test for the well-being of our world. I set out, determined to share my findings, to turn the panic into preparation, to respect the Mothman not as a harbinger of doom, but as a reluctant, misunderstood sentinel. Months went by since the bridge incident, and thankfully, no major disasters ensued. The legend of the Mothman faded back into the fog of town mythos, and life slowly returned to normal. I remained alert and cautious, but found comfort in the possibility that the Mothman wasn't our enemy. But I can't shake the feeling that its eyes are always upon us, and that foreboding figure could return at any moment, not as a monster, but as a warning call from the shadows to which it returned. Nessie's rage. Cold winds whipped across Loch Ness as my friends and I embarked on a camping trip we'd planned for months. Nessie tales always fascinated us, but we never actually believed them. Not really. Call us adventurers, or perhaps just ignorant, but we longed to camp beside the mysterious waters, to have our own stories about the loch's restless spirit. The camp was lively, with the crackle of the fire and the murmur of our voices. We joked about Nessie, making wagers on who would be the first to catch a glimpse. The whiskey passed around, warming us against the chill of the Scottish night, and in its haze, we dared each other to go for a midnight swim. That's when the earth began to tremble. Soft ripples lapped the shore before morphing into forceful waves. We scrambled from our makeshift pier, casting uneasy glances at the black water. The loch shouldn't have waves, not like these. As if provoked by our hubris, a monstrous roar shattered the stillness, its source unseen, the echo reverberating against the surrounding hills. In the dim light of our dying fire, I saw its silhouette. A serpentine shape towered above the surface, eyes aglow with the same eerie blue of deep water. We froze, the playful bets and laughter dead in our throats. With a sound like thunder, the creature plunged, sending a surge that drenched the campsite. Desperate, we ran, abandoning equipment in our flight. Our car sat a mile away, our salvation, if only we could reach it. The forest between us and safety seemed alive, as though every shadow concealed eyes watching, waiting. The loch was angry, we knew that now, and we were paying the price for our taunts. Battering branches and gasping for breath, we finally arrived at the car. But it wouldn't start. No matter how many times we turned the key, it only groaned in protest. Through the windshield, an amplified ripple in the loch caught our eye, then another roar, closer, earth-shattering. The car jolted as if slapped by an unseen force. We huddled together, terror gripping us tight, and then silence. The air suffocating as we waited for a fate we felt certain was coming, arrived at last. We were in its domain, victims of Nessie's rage. Wendigo's revenge. Deep in the Canadian forests of Ontario, where the pines reach like fingers to the sky, and the chill in the air can seep into your bones, there's an old legend the locals whisper about when the nights draw in. They say a creature roams, half man, half spirit, born from a sinister hunger that eats at the soul. This is not a place for the weak-hearted, especially not when the moon hangs low and the cries of unknown beasts echo through the trees. The town of Kenora was a mere blip against the expansive wilderness, hosting a population that could be counted on two hands. My family had lived here for generations, running the small bait shop that kept fishermen equipped for their forays into the murky lakes. I grew up on tales of the forests, of the animals, the spirits, and of the Wendigo, a tale to keep kids from venturing too far into the woods. I brushed off these stories as folklore until one fall when the deer started to disappear. The hunters talked in hushed tones about tracks unlike any they'd seen, too large to be any known animal, with peculiar, elongated strides. The chilled wind, which rustled the orange leaves, carried an unfamiliar, pungent odor that clashed with the usual earthy scents of the forest. My curiosity was piqued when Old Man Peterson didn't return from his hunting trip. Search parties were organized, scouring the forest. I joined in, armed only with a flashlight and my father's old hunting rifle. Days passed with no sign. We found his campsite, but it was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. After that, an oppressive silence settled over Kenora. People spoke less, locked their doors earlier, and never strayed too far from the light. The tales of the Wendigo, once spoken with a jovial undertone, became stark warnings. It was the night of the first snow when I saw it, eyes like burning coals set into a gaunt, ashen face with antlers that arched into the blackened sky. I was walking home from the shop when a spine-chilling screech split apart the wintry stillness. I froze, staring into the tree line. The Wendigo glided forward, not quite walking, not quite floating, a specter of hunger given form. Panic seized me, and I ran, crunching through the snow with wild abandon, while the creature's ghostly howls filled my ears. I burst into my house, panting and hysterical, declaring that the Wendigo had come for vengeance, for what I knew not. My father hushed me, though his concerned gaze betrayed his disbelief. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat, listening to the eerie silence outside, wondering if I alone believed. The days grew darker, and so did the mystery. More people went missing, and the creature's haunting cries became the dreadful lullabies that spun through Kenora's frigid nights. The last straw came when a child from the neighboring house vanished from his bed, with only a set of chillingly large footprints leading away into the forest. Fear congealed within me. I had to do something, anything. I decided to delve into the local library's archives, searching for answers. There, amidst dust-covered tomes and yellowed newspaper clippings, I found mention of a dispute long ago between our ancestors and an indigenous tribe that worshipped the spirit of the land. A curse was spoken in wrath, that a hunger which could never be sated would find us, descendants of those who had wronged them. Could it be that the Wendigo's vengeance was focused on my town, on my family? That evening, I shared my fears with Father. His face became as pale as the waning moon, and he confessed a secret passed down through generations. He handed me a silver amulet, crafted by the local tribe as a symbol of peace. It was supposed to protect our family from the curse, to keep the Wendigo at bay, but its power was forgotten over time, relegated to mere family heirloom. The realization struck me like a cold snap. We had lost our reverence for the peace offering. We had invited the revenge upon ourselves. I knew what I had to do. Clutching the amulet, I ventured out into the freezing night toward the forest, where the Wendigo had revealed itself. My breath formed clouds that trailed behind me as a silent prayer left my lips. The forest was an abyss, shadows within shadows. I reached the clearing where I had first seen the abomination. "Here I stand, ready to make amends," I shouted into the darkness. The wind carried a low growl, a sound that seemed to come from every direction, encompassing me in a blanket of dread. Then all went silent. A figure emerged, a grotesque silhouette against the snow. My hands trembled as I lifted the silver amulet. The creature halted, and I could feel its gaze piercing through me. It bent low, sniffing the trinket, then let out a mournful cry that vibrated through the air. I spoke of peace, of wrongs to be righted, and of respect for those we had harmed. And then, as though understanding, the Wendigo backed away, disappearing into the forest with one last long glance. I returned to Kenora as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, uncertain if the events of the night had been a victory or a mere postponement of our reckoning. But I came back with hope and a vow to honor the pact our ancestors had made. The forest remains, whispering secrets as it has for millennia, and we respect its boundaries. There is peace, for now. And the story of the Wendigo's revenge will no longer be a tale for frightening children, but a solemn lesson